Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my first of hopefully many reviews of books on the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. So I have two books from the Walter Scott Prize long list to talk to you about today. Eden Glassie by Melissa Lukashenko and Sea Scraper by Benjamin Wood, both of which I've read in the past couple of weeks. I thought I would talk through my thoughts on those books today, and then I will do the same as and when I read more books from the long list. I will say that so far, Eden Glassie and Sea Scraper are both books that I liked but didn't love. I feel like both of them, there were some really interesting elements in them, but they weren't like 100% my kind of book. They weren't 100% my cup of tea. And I wasn't like hugely invested in the stories. And last year, the Walter Scott Prize long list was like massively successful for me. There was one book I didn't like, but like 7 books of the books I read from the long list ended up in my like best books of the year last year. Like last year was a very successful long list for me. And I feel like, I just have a feeling that this year's long list is not going to be as successful for me personally. One thing I really like about reading along with the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction every year is that it does often push me to read things that are slightly outside my comfort zone or are not necessarily the kind of historical fiction that I would usually read. It often makes me read historical fiction that is slightly more literary than I would usually reach for, and sometimes that's really successful and sometimes that's less successful. So I think let's start off with Eden Glassie by Melissa Lukashenko, which I preferred out of the two, and I would also say that I feel like Sea Scraper just definitely wasn't my kind of book, whereas I feel like Eden Glassie, I didn't give myself the best reading experience of it, if that makes sense. I got Eden Glassie out of the library on ebook, which meant I could only read it on my phone. And I didn't realise that the library loan time for ebooks is shorter than for audiobooks. So I thought I had longer to read it than I did. And therefore I read like the first half, like very slowly, little by little over like 10 days, and then the second half in like 2 days, which wasn't necessarily very good like reading pacing on my part. But anyway, let me tell you about Eden Glassie by Melissa Lukashenko. This is a dual timeline novel with one timeline taking place in the 19th century and one in the 21st century. And it's about the history of Australia and the history of colonialisation and the sort of long legacy of that. And it's a really interesting novel, engaging with some bits of history that I knew a bit about, but also lots of bits of history that I didn't know very much about. I don't know that much about Australian history, and I found this really interesting from a historical perspective. As I said, there are 2 timelines. Like, I think if you were to divide up the chapters and sort of the pages by timeline, probably more of the book takes place in the 19th century timeline. But I think I felt the 21st century timeline was more the focus, and that was certainly where like I was more emotionally invested. And that is sort of the frame. So we begin and we end in the 21st century, though we skip back and forward between them in between. In the present day, we start with an elderly woman called Eddie, who at the beginning of the book has a fall and ends up in hospital. And in hospital, she ends up meeting a journalist who decides he wants to interview her. And in his headlines and in his articles, in the things he writes about her, he names her Queensland's oldest Aboriginal. She is very elderly, around 100, and he begins to interview her about the history of First Nations people in Australia and about her experiences as a young woman. Though we begin with Eddie, the focus in the 21st century isn't so much on Eddie as it is on her granddaughter, Winona, who is an activist and really passionate and angry, and is a really great character. I really liked Winona. Winona ends up sort of befriending a doctor at the hospital called Johnny, who just has like a massive crush on Winona, and she has like no time for it at all. And their friendship and their relationship was really interesting, and a part of the story I really enjoyed, and is also used to kind of explore quite interesting themes. Johnny has recently found out that one of his grandparents was First Nations, and he is sort of reevaluating his identity in light of that. But Winona kind of says that he doesn't have the right to claim that identity because it hasn't been part of his life. And that discussion, and whether identity is more about your like biological heritage or your culture, like that is quite an interesting discussion in the book. So that's the present day plotline, and this all takes place in Brisbane, which was long before called Eden Glassie, hence the title of the book. Then in the mid-19th century Strand, we're following a young First Nations man called Mulanyin, who moves from living with his family to living in Brisbane, interacting with a lot more white people, becoming more aware of what colonisation is doing to his country, and how that impacts him and the people around him. He falls in love with a young woman called Nita, who is First Nations but has spent quite a lot of her childhood living with a white family, who she is now a housemaid for. And we're following their story as well. As I said, I found this book really, really historically interesting. I feel like I learned lots of stuff that I didn't know before, and I feel like the way this book looks at history, both in the sense of what was happening in the 19th century, but also how the long legacy of colonialisation is impacting 21st century Australia, and how the characters in the 21st century are grappling with their own history. That stuff was really, really interesting, and I thought was done really well. I always like it when books on the Walter Scott Prize long list look at like history and what history means and how we interpret history and how we make history and sort of tell stories about the past and what that means, and kind of the power that presenting history in a certain way can have. So I found that really, really interesting. As I said, I do feel like I was much more invested in the 21st century plotline than the 19th century plotline, and especially when I read books for the Walter Scott Prize and I'm always thinking about like them as works of historical fiction, I wish I had been even more invested in the 19th century section. Though as I said, I do feel like the 21st century section was also about history, just not historical, if you see what I mean. So I don't know. I was trying to think about why I was less invested in the 19th century section. I think it's partly because I just really, really like Winona as a character, and I really liked Winona and Johnny and his sort of like absolute immediate lovelorn crush on her, and her like dismissal of him, but like she also kind of likes him a bit. Like I really, really enjoyed their dynamic, and therefore I was very invested in that. And I think sometimes that does happen when you read a dual timeline novel. You just end up much more invested in one timeline than another, and therefore you're less excited when you're reading the other timeline. I would also say that like the first few chapters of the 19th century timeline, we jumped quite a few years, and so it took a little bit longer to get into the story in the 19th century, whereas you were like right in the story in the 21st century section. There were like a lot more characters and a lot more going on in the 19th century section. Like I think it was less focused in the 21st century section. But as I said earlier, I do think I didn't read Eden Glassie in the best way. Like I think if I had read it in like 4 days or a week, like at a normal pace rather than the weird pace I read it at, I probably think I would have enjoyed it more and would have like got invested sooner. Also didn't hugely love the ending, or at least there were things about the ending that I found slightly dissatisfying. But I think, one, I can't really tell you what that is without a spoiler, but also I think that is very much down to personal taste. Like it's one of those things where, you know, sometimes you're reading a book and you're like, oh, I don't think this quite works. And then sometimes you're reading a book and you're like, oh, this definitely doesn't work for me, but I know that that's me, not the book, if you see what I mean. So overall, I would say I really enjoyed Eden Glassie. Probably like a 4-star read for me rather than a 5-star read, but I did find it really interesting, and I would recommend it, and I would probably recommend reading it in a more sensible way than I did. But yes, next I want to talk about Sea Scraper by Benjamin Wood. So this book takes place in the 1950s in the north of England, and it is about a young man called Thomas. He's 20 years old, he lives with his mother, and his life is very much dominated by his work, and his work is to take out his horse and cart and comb the beach and the sea for shrimp. And he therefore spends all his time at low tide doing this. But he's also kind of harbouring dreams of being a folk singer, and he likes to play guitar in his spare time. And the sort of inciting incident, I suppose, is the appearance in Thomas's life of a man called Edgar, who is a film director from the US, who says that he wants to use this beach, the beach that Thomas knows so well, as a setting in one of his films, and will Thomas take him out in his cart and show him this very misty, atmospheric beach. And things kind of go on from there. I feel like it was much simpler to explain the premise of Sea Scraper than it was to explain the premise of Eden Glassie. I guess because this only has one strand and is very short. But I would say that actually, in a way, this is a less focused book than Eden Glassie. And it's dealing with a lot of different themes, considering how short a book it is. It only takes place over sort of, I guess, just over 24 hours. And we're following Thomas sort of step by step during that time. I'm going to put this book down because the library covering is reflecting in the light. But anyway, I would say that Sea Scraper was probably a book that was just a bit too literary and a bit too quiet for my taste. I enjoyed the reading experience of it. I enjoyed Thomas as a character. I enjoyed his interactions with Edgar and his interactions with his mother. I found it a very, very atmospheric novel. And I think definitely sort of the descriptions of the beach in the mist were really well done. And I think the themes in this book are quite interesting in the way it looks at sort of the 1950s and the legacy of the Second World War, how that is impacting people, how the world is changing, but not entirely. And I think especially because Thomas's job is quite old-fashioned. He is using a horse and cart. He's using the same methods that his grandfather used before him. And in a way, he's sort of like, he is a relic of a bygone era, even though he's only 20 years old. And it's quite like a juxtaposition and a clash of worlds to see simultaneously Thomas going out into the sea on his horse and cart and cars in the town and a tape player. There's a tape player at one point. So there's sort of a clash of old and new, which I thought was quite interesting. And as a coming of age story, there's some interesting elements. I think part of the book is about sort of Thomas deciding whether or not he wants more from life and how happy he is or isn't with his current lot in life. And all that was quite interesting while I was reading it. Like, I found it an interesting read and an enjoyable read, but I basically feel like this is a book I will never think of again. It's not a book I'm likely to come back to. It's not a book that's made much impression on me or that I was like really emotionally invested in. And I'm not sure that I quite got it. I'm not sure that I got precisely what it was trying to say, or that I like properly connected with it, if you see what I mean. Like I said, I just think it was a bit too literary and quiet for me. And I think especially like in the first half of the book, I was enjoying it more because I was kind of expecting something big to happen that would explain, that would like warrant the story. And there is a bit more like action in the middle section of the book, but there was one part or like one sequence of that action that didn't work for me at all, which I think is a personal taste thing. But also, actually, it isn't really building up to something dramatic. It's a much quieter story than that. And so that didn't quite work for me and felt a bit anticlimactic. I would also say that it was a bit too unfocused for me. It's a book that is exploring lots of different themes and looking at lots of different things. And I sort of wasn't sure what the main point of the book was. Maybe it's just Tom's coming of age story and that's fine. Like, is the focus Tom's friendship with Edgar? Is the focus Edgar and what Edgar teaches Tom about life? Because I found Edgar quite interesting. And in some ways he seems to be the focus and in other ways he isn't. Is it about Tom and his mum? Is it about Tom's music? Is it about Tom's relationship with the father he's never known? Or is it something else? So, for example, I came across a quote from the Booker Prize judges about this book because it was on the Booker Prize. And to be honest, I probably should have known when I knew it was on the Booker Prize long list that it would be too literary for me. But I ended up coming across this quote because there is a song that features in the book, and you can go and listen to the song on the author's website. So I went to listen to it, which I did enjoy. And there was a quote from the Booker Prize judges, and they said, "It's a book about dreams, an exploration of class and family, a celebration of power and the glory of music, a challenge to the limits of literary realism, and, stunningly, a love story." And I think actually that quote, that was obviously about why the Booker Prize judges loved this book, explains quite a lot of why I didn't love it. I think the challenges to the limits of literary realism, the things that challenged that, like, didn't really work for me. I feel like I can't really explain more than that without spoiling. I would have liked more about music in it because I love books about music. There was a bit about music in this, but I feel like it wasn't enough of a focus. I feel like there are many books I love that write about music in a really powerful way that really moves me, and I didn't really feel that in Sea Scraper. And also and stunningly a love story. This book has a bit of a love story in it that feels like it is a really minor subplot and is not centre stage at all, and then suddenly is like quite important at the end. And that for me really didn't work because it felt quite shoehorned in, and it felt like suddenly the focus of the book just shifted at the end. And like I said, I think this is very much a personal taste thing. I feel like so many people have loved this book. I feel like everyone I've seen talking about Sea Scraper just absolutely loves it, and I just didn't quite. I feel like I've been very negative. I didn't sort of hate the reading experience or anything. I enjoyed reading it, but I feel like I put it down just feeling like I didn't really get it. It was a bit forgettable for me. I think there were just some things I was missing because it is just too literary for my taste. I just need more plot than that. And I just need more of a focus than that, and more of a like narrative arc than is here. Like, there's a lot of interesting themes in it, but I feel like the themes were all explored quite subtly rather than deeply for me. And I just wanted a bit more from this book. It was all just a bit too quiet and unfocused. And I like books with a bit more of a punch, I guess. You know, if I compare Sea Scraper with a book like Clear by Karis Davis, which was on the Walter Scott Prize long list last year, they are both very, very short books that are quite like thematic focused and are relatively quiet in their stories. But I loved Clear so much because Clear had like a real narrative focus, a real like interesting central relationship that was clearly the focus and that I found really interesting and that I was really emotionally invested in. And it had lots of different themes, but it had one like main theme. Like, it is in many ways a book about language, and I loved that about it. And so I found all the secondary themes really interesting, but I kind of knew what the main theme was. Whereas I feel like in Sea Scraper, there wasn't like the narrative drive that I love and that I like, but also I just didn't quite know what the focus was, and that's something I really struggle with in really literary fiction. I just want to know like what the main thing is. I just want to know what the point is. But I often do feel that when I read a book that is quite literary and that has like a split focus, I often end up finishing the book feeling like none of the themes were explored in as much depth as I would like, and also feeling like I missed the point because I didn't really know what the book was trying to do or trying to say. So there we go. Those are the first two books I've read from the Walter Scott Prize long list. As I said, I just have a feeling that the long list is not going to be as much to my taste this year, but you know, there are many books hopefully to go. The next two I'm going to read, I have here The Matchbox Girl by Alice Jolly. The author very kindly sent me a review copy. I'm looking forward to this. I think this will be a really, really interesting one. And I also got out from the library Helm by Sarah Hall, which I'm excited to read. I don't know if this is going to be like a way too literary for me or if I'm going to really love it. I think it could really go either way with Helm from everything I've heard about it. And I'm just kind of hoping it will be like another Cuddy by Benjamin Myers kind of a book, but maybe it won't. But I just really hope it is, so we'll see. I'm really looking forward to those two, and hopefully I will have read them and, you know, we'll have a review up about them in the next few weeks. I'm looking forward to getting to some other things from the long list as well. I have very high hopes for The Two Roberts by Damien Barr. I just have a feeling I'm going to love that, so maybe that's what I'll read after I've read those two. I've got that and Venetian Vespers on hold at the library, but they haven't come in yet, so those will probably be my next two after these, I guess. That's all for now. Do let me know if you have read either of these books, what you thought of them, if you've read anything from the Walter Scott Prize long list. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.